The icy rain struck the glass ceiling of the penthouse like 1,000 needles, each drop echoing through the stillness of a room built for power but soaked in silence. A man lay collapsed beside an overturned chair, his breathing shallow, his hands still clutching the half-scorched edge of a legal document. The fireplace hissed, swallowing the last corner of a burning will, a will that had been rewritten just hours ago, naming 5 boys the world had forgotten. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan flickered below, oblivious to the fact that Alexander Morgan, the billionaire no one could touch, might not make it through the night. And just as his vision blurred into darkness, a small hand reached for his chest. "Stay with us," whispered a child's voice, cracked but urgent. "We're not done saving you yet." Somewhere in the hallway, an emergency protocol activated, one the world was never meant to see. And that was how it began, not with a boardroom betrayal, not with a press release, but with 5 street kids, a failing heart, and a vow stronger than blood. The moment the paramedics arrived, they hesitated, not because of the man on the floor, but because of the 5 children standing in a circle around him like sentinels. Their presence was jarring in this world of imported marble and whisper-quiet elevators. Street-worn sneakers on Persian rugs, second-hand jackets beside custom Italian suits. One of them, a boy no older than 15, locked eyes with the lead EMT and said, "We'll go with him. He doesn't trust hospitals. He trusts us." The conviction in his voice left no room for argument. Alexander Morgan was barely conscious, his lips moving in silent protest, but his fingers twitched when Dylan, the smallest of the boys, took his hand. "We're here," Dylan said, his voice barely more than breath. "We've got you. You promised to fight. So fight." Outside, the snow had started to fall, coating the city in a hush of white. The world below kept spinning, cabs honking, screens blinking, stocks crashing, but in the back of the ambulance, time hung still. Ethan held Alexander's file in his lap, flipping through blood work, tumor markers, the latest CT scans, and the scribbled margins where Dylan had written his counter-diagnoses. Tyler and Thomas took turns rerouting signals from their devices, pinging the hospital's intake system, scrambling the location tag just enough to keep unwanted eyes away. Lucas, quiet as ever, sketched Alexander's vitals in a worn notebook like it was a scene worth remembering. "He's crashing," one paramedic shouted as the heart monitor beeped erratically. "No, he's stabilizing," Dylan corrected. "Just give it 12 more seconds. We adjusted the dosages this morning." The medic blinked, glancing from Dylan to the man seizing on the gurney. And as if on cue, the flatline dipped back into rhythm, slow, uneven, but there. Still there. At the private facility, the boys moved like they'd rehearsed this 1,000 times. Dylan followed the physicians into the treatment chamber, updating them with clinical precision. Ethan stayed behind, confronting the hospital administrator. "We need full privacy. No media, no notifications to the family trust. All communication goes through me. Or him." He pointed at Thomas, who stood by the door, running perimeter surveillance on a tablet that looked years out of place in his hands. "Your children," the administrator began, clearly confused. "This man is the CEO of Morgan Investments. You can't just..." "We can," Ethan interrupted. "He signed a provisional power of attorney 3 weeks ago. Check the signature. Cross-reference it against his corporate records. I assure you, it'll match. And if it doesn't, I'll have our legal advisor here in 10 minutes. His voice didn't waver. His eyes didn't blink. Inside the ward, Dylan stood on a step stool beside the hospital bed, adjusting the flow. "We need to start phase 2, he said calmly. "The standard chemo protocol will kill him faster than the cancer. We already outlined this. It's in the orange folder, tab 6. The attending physician raised a skeptical brow. "You're not even in high school. And your protocol has a 9% survival rate for his cancer type," Dylan replied evenly. "So maybe we both need to grow up fast." For 3 hours, they worked in silence, each boy playing a role no one had taught them, no one had prepared them for, but somehow they knew. They weren't doctors. They weren't analysts. But they were survivors. And survivors adapt. Later that night, while the machines beeped softly beside Alexander's bed, Ethan stood by the window, staring out at the city. Lucas joined him, slipping him a sketch, one he had drawn during the ambulance ride. It was Alexander, surrounded by 5 shadows that looked like angels and wolves all at once. "He doesn't look like a billionaire here," Lucas said. "He isn't," Ethan replied. "Not anymore. Not to us." Back at the mansion, chaos brewed. News had leaked. Someone at the gala had whispered too loudly. "Billionaire CEO adopts 5 homeless kids while battling cancer," read one headline. "Is it legacy, or lunacy?" read another. Commentators on finance shows dissected Alexander's decline. The Morgan Board of Directors scheduled an emergency meeting. Curtis Lawson, Alexander's longtime rival, was already making phone calls. Meanwhile, the boys continued their operation from inside the hospital. Dylan's makeshift protocol was working, slowly, carefully, it was working. Ethan met daily with Alexander's legal counsel, updating the guardianship paperwork, protecting the trust fund. The twins expanded their firewalls, tracing cyber attacks back to an anonymous firm, likely hired by Lawson. Lucas designed a new system of iconographic code so they could communicate across whiteboards without alerting watchful eyes. It wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was war. On the 4th night, Alexander opened his eyes for the first time. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sight of all 5 boys curled up in various corners of his hospital suite, one reading, one sketching, 2 huddled over a tablet, and Dylan fast asleep on a cot beside his bed, was enough. For a man who had once built empires to drown out the silence, this quiet was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. The next morning, he whispered, "How long was I gone?" 3 days, Ethan answered. "You flatlined once." "Twice, actually, but Dylan wouldn't let them call it. Said the second one didn't count." Alexander nodded, slowly, like every word weighed too much. "The board? They're circling. Lawson's preparing a coup. But we've built a firewall. And a plan." Alexander blinked. "Your children. We're family," Dylan corrected, emerging from the shadows with a medical chart. "And you're not dying until we're done saving you." A weak laugh escaped Alexander's chest. It sounded like gravel, but it was real. Outside the suite, a nurse paused, listening to the sound. The billionaire was laughing. The man who had ruled boardrooms with an iron tongue now sounded like he might actually be human. Back in the room, Ethan laid out their next steps. "We're moving you home. This place isn't safe. Too many eyes. We've converted the East Wing into a clean lab. Lucas has re-engineered the air filtration system, and Dylan's protocols are ready for real-time monitoring. The twins rigged a private server. And I have a meeting with Lawson next week." Alexander's brow furrowed. "Alone?" "Not alone," Ethan smirked. "Just first." Alexander studied him, this boy with 2 old eyes and the voice of someone who had never been allowed to be young. "Why?" Ethan leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Because you gave us something no one else ever did. A name. A place. A reason." Alexander closed his eyes, not in dismissal but in understanding. And for the first time since he'd read the word terminal in his diagnosis, he felt it, the terrifying, fragile, beautiful weight of being needed. And from that moment forward, everything changed. It began on a night when Alexander Morgan thought the world had already forgotten him. The penthouse was quiet in the wrong way. Not the comforting silence of solitude, but the aching hollowness of absence, of voices that had never been there to begin with. Snow tapped gently on the 64th floor windows, but he didn't look. He sat in front of the fire, whiskey untouched, watching the flames dance behind glass. The diagnosis lay open on his lap like a cruel letter from God. Stage 4. Inoperable. 3 months. Give or take, they said, like it was a negotiation. He'd built billion-dollar mergers out of nothing, but this he couldn't bargain with. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of a security monitor. He didn't mean to glance at it. He didn't care about security anymore. But something moved, quick, flickering, barely a shadow. He leaned in. The west alley beside his building, 5 figures. Small, fast, coordinated. Not criminals, not the usual kind. One of them knelt by a dumpster, covering someone smaller with a coat. Another stood watch. Alexander frowned. He hadn't felt curiosity in years. He pressed the intercom. Marla, call security. No, wait. Hold that. Bring them in. Sir. Marla's voice crackled through. Bring who? The boys outside, he said. Tell them there's food in the garage lounge. Let's see who shows up when you offer heat instead of handcuffs. 15 minutes later, they were there, hesitant, defensive, hungry. 5 boys, dripping snow and suspicion. They stood in the corner of the lounge like stray dogs waiting to be kicked. Ethan was the first to speak. You the owner? I am. We're not staying. Just warming up. Alexander studied them. Ethan's tone was defiant, but beneath it was calculation. He was reading the room, the exits, the advantages. The twins stood back to back, always touching something electronic. Lucas clutched a sketchpad like it was armor. And Dylan. Dylan didn't look at anything but Alexander. What's wrong with your eyes? Alexander asked him. I see what other people miss, Dylan replied, unfazed. You're dying. The room fell still. Alexander let out a slow breath. I suppose I am. And you're angry about it, Dylan added, climbing into the nearest chair without permission. But not because you're afraid. You're angry because it makes you irrelevant. That one hit like a punch to the chest. No one had spoken to him like that in decades. Ethan stepped in front of Dylan. We'll go. Sit, Alexander said sharply. All of you. They didn't obey, they chose to stay. And that made all the difference. Over the next few hours, conversation peeled back the first layer of frost. The boys didn't offer pity, and Alexander didn't offer charity. He asked questions. They answered if they felt like it. He learned that Ethan used to sneak into libraries to study business books. His favorite was The Art of Corporate Warfare. That the twins had once rigged a city traffic light grid just across town unnoticed. That Lucas remembered everything he saw, once drawing an entire subway map from memory after one ride. That Dylan carried a notebook of symptoms and patterns, hoping to one day find a cure for what killed his mom, and what's killing you. Alexander didn't know when it happened. Maybe it was when Tyler took apart his custom coffee machine and made it work better. Or when Lucas sat silently by the fire and drew him, not his face, but the loneliness in his hands. Or when Ethan, unprompted, explained how to hide assets offshore to avoid a hostile takeover. Something cracked open inside him. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't soft. It was real. He gave them one night, one single night in the guest lounge. But the next morning, they were still there. Dylan brought him coffee. Tyler and Thomas had hacked into the penthouse climate control and optimized the heating zones. Lucas left a folded drawing of his late wife's favorite scarf. He had only seen a picture on a shelf, but he'd captured it perfectly. And Ethan. Ethan handed him a document. What's this? A trust structure, Ethan said plainly. For emergency guardianship. If you're serious about what you said last night, that you're alone and dying, you might want to think about who gets to say what happens to you in your last 3 months. If not us, then someone worse." Alexander stared at the file. The words felt like ice melting against skin. They didn't want his money. They wanted a place. A purpose. That night, Alexander signed the temporary guardianship papers, not because he pitied them, but because for the first time since his diagnosis, he wanted to live long enough to see what would happen if he did. Weeks passed like scenes in a film no one had written. He let them stay. Then he built them rooms. Then he invited them to breakfast. Then they simply belonged. The penthouse, once a museum of wealth, became something else. Ethan turned one library into a command center, mapping Alexander's network of companies. The twins built a surveillance rig using spare parts and an old server. Lucas filled the empty halls with sketches, portraits of Alexander, of the boys, of memories he never knew he missed. Dylan spent his days reading medical journals and sitting silently beside Alexander's chair, checking his pulse like a vigil. The transformation was gradual, but undeniable. Until the gala. Until Alexander collapsed mid-speech while addressing the future of Morgan Investments. Until the world remembered he was sick, and smelled blood. That night, the boys moved. Ethan took his ring of access cards and secured the building. Dylan called the pharmacy to confirm the backup dosages they had predicted might be necessary. Thomas rerouted all incoming communications. Tyler jammed the security feeds long enough for them to exit the building without alerting the press. Lucas held Alexander's hand in the car, whispering, "It's not time yet. You still owe us a story." By the time they reached the hospital, they weren't just 5 kids with a dying man. They were the only people on Earth with a plan. The hospital lights were too white. Not the soft, healing kind, these buzzed like interrogation lamps, illuminating every wrinkle, every tremble in Alexander's hands as he lay unconscious in the emergency suite. Machines beeped with cold consistency, reading life in numbers. Around him stood 5 boys who didn't belong, and yet somehow, belonged more than anyone else. Ethan paced near the window, fists clenched, his mind racing faster than the snow falling outside. Tyler and Thomas were already at the nurse's station, hacking into the patient system through a disguised tablet. Lucas sat in the corner sketching diagrams he couldn't explain yet, but somehow felt mattered. And Dylan, the youngest, stood over Alexander's motionless body, whispering the symptoms out loud like an incantation he'd memorized in nightmares. Blood pressure's crashing because of an immune flare. But the meds they're giving him are wrong. His enzymes don't metabolize standard immunosuppressants. He's got a rare mutation. It's in the file. Page 11. They didn't read it. He wasn't panicking. He was planning. Ethan looked at Dylan like he was watching someone transform before his eyes. "Get it fixed." "I will. But I need access. And a real doctor who'll listen." Tyler's voice crackled from the hallway. "Got something. There's a specialist, Dr. Renee Caldwell. She's the one who first documented that mutation. Problem is, she's been blacklisted." "By who?" The silence was heavy. Thomas looked up, his voice barely audible. "Your company." Ethan froze. "What?" Lucas unfolded a piece of paper, one he'd drawn weeks ago. On it was the Morgan Investments web, acquisitions, mergers, buried shells. At the center was a symbol Lucas had drawn from a company plaque he'd seen once, in an old video of Alexander's, Crescent Holdings. "That's who paid to have her silenced," Lucas said softly. "They own Morgan's medical division. And they're already moving." "What do you mean?" Thomas turned the screen. "They've filed an emergency petition. Claiming Alexander's incapacitated. They're trying to assume guardianship, take his assets, dissolve his holdings, and sell everything off within 48 hours. They're using his illness," Ethan muttered. "To kill the man and the empire." "No," Dylan said calmly. "They're just finishing what they started. They gave him the wrong drugs on purpose. It hit like a thunderclap. Every piece fell into place. Alexander wasn't just dying, he was being erased. And they were the only ones who could stop it. Ethan pulled them into a supply closet. The light was flickering overhead, the linoleum floor stained with the echo of old emergencies. He laid out the battle plan, not just to save Alexander's life, but his legacy. They had less than 2 days. "Lucas," he said, "I need you to find the original board meeting minutes, anything showing how Crescent Holdings got power over the medical division." "On it." "Tyler, Thomas, get into Caldwell's personal database. Find a way to contact her. If anyone can reverse what they did to him, it's her. We'll have to go through layers of encryption." Ethan didn't blink. "Then break them." He turned to Dylan last. "You're going to talk to the hospital. They won't listen to a kid. They'll listen when you show them what you know, and when you tell them the man they're about to lose is the only one who ever listened to you." For the first time, Dylan looked scared. And then he nodded. They scattered like trained operatives, not orphans. Not strays. Not forgotten. An hour later, Dylan stood in front of the chief resident, eyes wide but unwavering. He listed enzyme pathways, reaction profiles, gene markers. Nurses stared. A resident dropped her coffee. And then, finally, the chief looked at him and said, "You're not wrong." Back in the penthouse, Lucas and Ethan uncovered something darker. Crescent Holdings hadn't just moved in to take Alexander's company. They had been watching him for years. Every boardroom betrayal, every sudden executive exit, it had been orchestrated. Alexander had been surrounded by people wearing masks. And one of those masks belonged to someone still inside. "Marla," Ethan whispered. "His assistant. She always knew where he was. What he signed. What he missed." Lucas stared at the records. "She's the one who filed the paperwork with the court. She's selling him out." Ethan didn't speak. He just walked out. Back at the hospital, Alexander stirred. His hand twitched. His eyes opened halfway. He was awake, but only just. Dylan ran to him, clutching his hand, whispering the truth in pieces, terrified to say it all. "They tried to take everything. But we're not going to let them." Alexander blinked. "We? Your family," Dylan said. "Whether you like it or not." Meanwhile, Tyler and Thomas cracked Caldwell's firewall. They found a private number, a hidden blog, a forgotten journal filled with treatments never published. Ethan made the call. "Dr. Caldwell," he said, breathless. "Your patient is Alexander Morgan. And they're killing him." There was a pause. "Then, tell me everything." By the time dawn broke, the war had changed. Alexander's pulse was stabilizing. Dr. Caldwell was on a jet. And Ethan stood in front of Marla in the boardroom. She looked at him with practiced indifference. "You're just a child. And you're just afraid," he replied. "We know what you did. We have the data. The backups. The signatures. The emails. You think anyone will believe a pack of strays?" "No," Ethan said. "But they'll believe the man you failed to kill." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because Alexander Morgan, half alive but fully aware, walked into the room behind him. The silence was absolute. He looked at Marla the way a man looks at a stranger. Like something he thought he knew had turned to dust. "You always told me I needed to be ruthless," he said quietly. "Turns out, all I ever needed was to stop being alone." He didn't fire her. He didn't scream. He just walked away. And in that moment, the board knew, the empire would not fall. Not today. The fire crackled gently in the marble hearth, casting a warm glow across the penthouse that once felt like a mausoleum. The walls, once cold and echoing, now pulsed with the quiet energy of life, of children laughing somewhere down the hallway, of footsteps that weren't just staff. Alexander Morgan sat in a deep leather armchair, draped in a thick gray blanket, a cup of tea cooling in his hand. For the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about balance sheets or mergers. He was just watching the snow fall over Manhattan, and breathing. Behind him, Dylan quietly approached and laid a worn, dog-eared medical journal on the table. "It's from Dr. Caldwell. She said the gene therapy might still be experimental, but the numbers are promising." Alexander turned, his eyes softer than they used to be. "Will it buy me more time?" Dylan didn't sugarcoat it. "Maybe. But that's not the point anymore, is it?" Alexander nodded slowly. "No. I think the point is I got to see something I didn't deserve. And now I have to protect it." Lucas entered next, his fingers stained with charcoal. "I drew something for you." He handed over a sketch, a portrait of the 5 boys, standing in front of Alexander, but this time, not as orphans. As a family. Lucas had even added Alexander's cane and silver hair, but drawn his eyes younger. Brighter. "I don't look that good," Alexander said with a half-smile. "You will," Lucas whispered. "You already do." There was a knock. Ethan stood in the doorway in a pressed shirt and blazer that didn't quite fit. His street edge hadn't vanished, but now it carried something else, purpose. "I talked to Caldwell. She's willing to testify about Crescent Holdings. She's already filed an injunction with the medical board. The whole boardroom coup. It's over. They're under investigation." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "You ran a corporate war like it was a street hustle." Ethan smirked. "Same rules. Just better suits." Alexander chuckled, a deep, full sound that felt foreign to his own ears. "You scare me." "Good. You need someone who does." The twins burst into the room then, arguing over a prototype device they'd built to monitor Alexander's vitals in real time. "It runs on less than 5% battery per day." Tyler insisted. "Only because I fixed the voltage regulator," Thomas shot back. Alexander held up a hand. "Just don't blow up my bedroom." They grinned. It was chaos, but a beautiful kind. Later that evening, as the city bathed itself in golden twilight, Alexander stood on the balcony with Ethan. The cold wind bit through their coats, but neither moved. "You know," Alexander said, "when I adopted you, I thought I was giving you something." "You were," Ethan replied. "But you gave me more." Ethan hesitated, then said, "We were surviving. Always. But you gave us roots. And weirdly, we gave you wings." They stood in silence for a while, the kind that says everything. Back inside, a letter sat unopened on the table. It was Alexander's original will, the one where everything was left to charities he barely cared about. But next to it sat a new document, drafted just hours earlier. This one had 5 names. No assistants. No lawyers. No board members. Just Ethan. Tyler. Thomas. Lucas. Dylan. His legacy wasn't in stocks or shares. It was in scraped knees, stolen snacks, and second chances. As night fell, the boys pulled blankets to the floor of the massive living room and watched old black and white movies, the kind Alexander once scoffed at. Now, he sat with them, quoting lines he barely remembered, letting Dylan fall asleep against his side. And somewhere between the flicker of the screen and the rhythm of 5 breathing chests, Alexander Morgan felt something shift inside him. Not healing. Not exactly. But peace. For the first time, he wasn't counting days left. He was living one. The boys weren't just saving his life with medicine, or schemes, or genius. They were saving it by filling it. With loyalty. With noise. With love. And maybe, just maybe, with enough time, he'd learn how to give it back. The wind outside howled. The fire burned low. But inside, in the warmth of the penthouse once built to keep the world out, 6 hearts beat as one. And the man who had everything but love finally had both.